67.
67, yeah.
It was our 50th anniversary on April 24th.
Oh my gosh, this coming.
67, 77, I think so. Yeah.
Right.
Is that
It
it?
was my 50th
on?
anniversary for his shoot down on April 24th, because it was 67. Nice. And we're now 2017, so it was 50 years.
50.
Yeah.
We got 51.
Yours? Yours was 66?
July
Was it-
15th.
what day?
July 15th.
July 15th.
That hardly seems like it did in 50 years, doesn't it?
Instead, it just seems like,
I know. It just seems
it's
And
impossible.
that must be Sherry's husband, huh? Hello?
Yes, that is her husband. Yes, that's right.
I wish I'd met you at the restaurant. Nice to see you.
I'm Jenny. I'm glad you could make it.
Those two lights are really bright.
Settle down, get
I
comfortable.
guess it's for the How come there aren't more people here? MIA.
Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics. My name is Connor
Talk
Porter,
later.
and I'm a member of the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board, the official student group of the Institute. The Student Advisory Board is a bipartisan group whose members can gain access to many great opportunities through their involvement. If you're a student and would like to join, please contact us by emailing dole.sab@ku.edu. After the presentation, we will have some time for questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and a student worker with a microphone will come to you. Please stand if you are able and ask one brief question. If you have difficulty hearing during the program, please alert one of our staff members or student volunteers who will assist you. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you to please turn off all your cell phones. And now, please join me in welcoming the director of the Dole Institute, Bill Lacey.
Hello? Okay, does it work? Well, welcome to the Dole Institute. We're so delighted that you could join us for today's program. Let me begin by saying that today's program and the exhibit, which hopefully a lot of you had a chance to see before the program, it's really stunning. It's in our reading room, and if you didn't get a chance to see it today, come back sometime and take a look. But they're all made possible by a gift from Harlan and Alice Ann Oakes in memory of Larry Oakes, Mr. Oakes' brother, and they're from Colorado Springs. As I said, check out the exhibit in the reading room if you haven't seen it yet. It really is, our team has done an outstanding job on it. It tells a remarkable story, and you're going to hear that remarkable story today. In the program, Your Story, His Story, The Legacy, Vietnam's POW MIA Wives. It's an amazing story, and it needs to be heard, and we're delighted at the Dole Institute that we have the chance to tell it. I'd like to present to you the Assistant Director and Senior Archivist of the Dole Institute of Politics, Audrey Coleman. Audrey?
Thanks, Bill. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yay!
Good afternoon, everyone. Before we get started with our interviews, I first wanted to thank our panelists, Jenny Robertson of San Diego, California, and Helene Knapp of Colorado Springs, who traveled here with her daughter, Cindy. Thanks so much for being here today with us to participate on this panel with us. And Heath Hardage Lee, who's our 2017 Dole Archives Curatorial Fellow. It's always a pleasure to see you, and so glad to see you again. I wanted to just ask you, before we start, obviously we've opened the exhibit, The League of Wives is open as of today, and will be open through the end of the year. So if you missed it today, you have many chances, and you need to tell all your friends and family to come all summer long and all fall, you have many opportunities to see it here at the Dole Institute, so we're so thrilled. Heath has been our guest curator, and before we get started, visiting with Helene and Jenny to have them share their memories of that time and their experience, I wanted to ask Heath to tell us a little bit about her, the gestation of her interest in the topic, and how we met, and her inspiration, how she met Helene and Jenny.
Yes. Oh, it's a great story, of course. So I started working on this topic right after I published my first book in 2014. Biographers are always looking for the next big thing. So I had published that book, and was giving a speech about it at Virginia Historical Society. And I'm on staff there, and someone had asked me to come see some papers. And these were the papers of Phyllis Galante, who Helene knew well. They worked together in the National League. She was a very active POW wife, and she also happened to be a friend of my mother's, a good friend of hers who had died very recently of leukemia. This was 2014 when she passed very unexpectedly. And I got the obituary first and thought, why didn't I ever interview her? I always meant to talk to her about her activism. And then thought about that, then was there giving a talk on my first book at Virginia Historical, and the staff said, we've got Phyllis's papers. Do you want to see them? And I said, of course I want to see them. So went in, saw the papers, and knew immediately that this was a huge story. And Phyllis's papers had left this sort of paper trail, this treasure map to all kinds of women, to Helene, to Jenny, to Sybil Stockdale on the West Coast, to Jane Denton on the East Coast. It started with Phyllis, but it just got bigger and bigger. And then in the summer of 2015, I lived in Des Moines for 6 years. I was getting ready to move back to my native Virginia, and I suddenly decided, I had sort of figured out that Senator Dole had been involved with these women, but I didn't really know the extent of it. And I saw that the Dole Institute had a grant, a travel type grant, to come do research on site. So I applied for the grant. I was fortunate to get it, and was connected with Audrey Coleman, and we spent 3 or 4 days going through the archive looking for POW stuff, and there were constituent letters, there were all kinds of artifacts, different things, and realized, it slowly dawned on me that Senator Dole had a huge hand in giving these women support after they had gone public, just helping amplify their voice, introduce them to people in Washington that were important. So from there, we talked, and we both decided, and this was Audrey's idea, that there was some exhibit potential because so many wives like Helene were giving me artifacts. And I'm a museum person, but I was like, I can't have these in my house. This is really worrying me. But we figured out that we really had an exhibit. Mm-hmm. So that was kind of how it all started. And I met Helene through friends when I was giving a talk in Colorado Springs on my last book, and I mentioned what I was working on, and they said, you must meet Helene Knapp. She was the national coordinator of the league after Sybil Stockdale. I was like, what? You're kidding. So I immediately tracked her down like a bloodhound, and we got that going. And then Jenny, I met when I was out at first interviewing Sybil Stockdale. Sybil sadly passed a couple of years ago, but I was out there meeting with her, and through Sybil and her sons, I met Jenny, was given Jenny's name, and I've gone back numerous times to interview Jenny and her crew in San Diego. So that's kind of a long way to say how I got into this, but it was complicated. It took some time.
And the exhibit tells the story, their story.
Yes.
And now we want to hear it from you. So Jenny and Helene, would you tell us, first start by telling us what the military wife experience was like during the 1960s and what it meant for you?
Well, when you say the 1960s, that was a whole decade. So that's a little bit difficult. By the way, hello, everybody. And I'm happy to be in your wonderful town. I'm from Colorado Springs, as she already told you. But just a little bit, I did spend a year at Fort Leavenworth, not in the prison.
Oh, that's fortunate.
My husband was invited as an Air Force officer to be in the school for a year. And so during that year, I actually took a course, an extension course from KU. So I'm really glad to see your beautiful town. Life in the 1960s was before the Vietnam War. So life for me with my wonderful husband, who I actually met in high school, was absolutely perfect. And being an Air Force wife in those years was also very good because the Air Force was different at that time. And so it wasn't until the war began and my brave husband, fighter pilot, test pilot, decided to volunteer for Vietnam. And when he came home and told me that, I wasn't sure where that country was. And I think most Americans were not very familiar with it either. So in 1966, he volunteered for Vietnam, and our idyllic life ended on April 24th, 1967, which is 50 years ago, if you can do math. And we're still waiting. I'm called a missing in action wife from the Vietnam War, and I have two grown children who were referred to as missing in action children. They weren't missing in action, but that was the easy way to say it. So my husband was bombing a MiG base over North Vietnam, and he was shot down by a missile. He had a backseater, and because of the quietness that was demanded of us by our government, we really weren't allowed to talk about our husband. And you'll be hearing more from that from Jenny as well. And so life then was quite miserable because I felt lonely and I didn't know anyone else who was a missing in action wife until perhaps 2 years later. So to make my story short, they have excavated his site at least 6 times now. The site is
Crash
in,
site.
pardon?
The crash site, they may
The
not
crash
know
site,
what
yes.
what the site is.
Yeah, the crash site. And they have found different pieces of the plane and so forth, but have not found human remains. And so the government continues to do that. And so basically, I'm still waiting for closure. But I was a missing in action wife from 1967 until 1978, when the government finally gave me what is called a PFOD, Preferred Finding of Death. And so I became an official widow 11 years later. So it was a different life than anything I ever expected. And I became very active because the prisoners and missing were not being treated properly or even known about. So does that about cover what you asked me to talk about?
I think so. So Jenny,
If you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer them.
Well, we have a lot more. We've got a lot of time.
Yeah. Okay.
So Jenny, how does that reconcile with your experience and
Well, there's
maybe a
lot of
before and
ditto
after?
in that. For me, was living in Lemoore, California, which is a Navy base in the San Joaquin Valley, and I don't know how many people are familiar with California, the San Joaquin Valley, but it's not a place for airplanes. My husband was a Navy pilot, an A4 pilot. And the reason it isn't is because it was so foggy in the wintertime they couldn't take off, and it was too hot in the summertime to take off and land. So not really sure why they had a Navy base there, but that's where we wound up. He left on cruise in 1965. That's the last time I saw him. In 66, he was shot down, July. In 67, a few of us wives moved to San Diego because Lemoore was just not good. The black car was going by all the time. Black car being the casualty assistance calls officer was going to different homes to tell them your husband's either dead or missing or POW or whatever. So, in 67 we moved to San Diego, and that's where I met Sybil Stockdale. There were maybe 8 of us at that time that lived in San Diego. In 67, Sybil was already there in Coronado, and she just gathered we gals together for support. We were just there for supporting each other. And from that support, developed a little bit more political activation of trying to get information, because the Navy didn't want to tell you anything. They said, never mind, we'll handle it.
And the wives called
And
this
the wives,
keep quiet
the
policy.
keep quiet policy. But, you know, you can also look at the other side, because at that time in the 60s, women were not outspoken as they are now. Certainly not. Also, at that time, you were a Navy wife, and there were certain expectations of Navy wives at that time. The rank of command. You kind of just went along with that. Wouldn't you say that that was, you know, you had the commanding officer and the XO, and then you junior officers, and the wives kind of fell into that. So at that time, women just didn't speak out. And so when they told us, you know, well, we'll handle it. You don't need to say anything to the press. Don't say anything to anybody. Don't tell them anything. Don't tell them your husband's a POW. Don't say anything. My husband was a POW. They released his picture the day after he was shot down. So that was good news, because like for you, you know, when they're MIA, there's just nothing. You have nothing to hang on to. So Sybil is the one that gathered us together, and then with some time and motivation, we decided to speak out. We decided not to wait anymore. About 68 or 9, maybe.
68.
Yeah, 68.
And Jenny, by the way, was a founding member
Member
of the League of Wives,
Yeah.
which, as you know, evolved into the
Into
National League, which
League.
Helene
Yeah,
was
it did
coordinator
evolve,
of.
yeah, over the years. It did.
Heath, I was going to ask you a little bit of, you know, building on the research that you've done about this group of women in Coronado. Could you tell us a little bit of background about Sybil and kind of set the scene there?
Sure. So Sybil, some of you may have heard of Jim Stockdale, Admiral Stockdale, he was the highest-ranking Navy POW, shot down in 60. Sybil was his wife. She was about 40 when he was shot down. So the ranks were reflected. If your husband was the commanding officer and you were the commanding officer's wife, you were automatically in charge of everything with the other wives, and that was just sort of the way it was. So Sybil felt immediately that she needed to take charge, and it was her duty to take the younger wives and sort of help them get through this period and set up some structure finally for them. Now, they all had to keep quiet for a while, but by October of 67, they were coming together. Jenny and I were talking about this earlier at Sybil's dining room table.
Dining room tables where
that
it started.
massive table. Yeah, that was kind of the birth of
it was.
the movement, was under Sybil, and Jenny was there, and Sandy Dennison, and
And
Karen
Butler.
Butler. There was sort of a core group, and they formed an organization called the League of Wives. of prisoners of war. So that was the original group. It starts on the West Coast, but then it starts to multiply. It starts to spread. It goes to the East Coast. And then Helene got involved in her husband was shot down in 67, and it was about 69 that he got very involved. So it spreads and multiplies, and it's sort of loose at first, but under Sybil's leadership, it coalesces into the National League of Families for POW, MIA, and Southeast Asia. And there are a series of coordinators, and Helene is the coordinator, which is like the president and the CEO of the League in 1972 to 1973. Phyllis Galante is her board chair, and that is a huge job. She can tell you about moving to DC to take that over. That was a big deal. So that's kind of the context of that.
So day-to-day life, you didn't feel empowered to talk about your husband's situation, or you were told specifically not to talk about it? How did that affect you? If you could clarify, or how did that isolate you from, what was that like?
We weren't told in those words, be quiet, but it was expected. You have to go back to the culture of that time. And that time, you weren't that outspoken. You weren't ready to take that initiative. I don't think it was.
And I think
it was
our
really
audience
that
would
time.
probably want to understand how difficult it was to get it started, and that Sybil actually went to the top leadership in the government in order for us to form this organization. I think that's important for you to know that.
We started writing letters, and you had to have some kind of a letterhead. I mean, who's writing? Well, it's all of us wives. Well, then what are we going to name it?
But she
what are
made
we going to
many
be called?
personal
Trips,
advances toward people in high government in order for this organization. And it's probably one of the most unique, I think, in the history of our wartime, that the mothers and wives of these brave men were allowed to form an organization that became nationwide. Bracelets were worn, bumper stickers, letter writing campaigns. It was the one thing that all American people supported. There were many protests to the war, but we were considered not protestable. I never had a problem in the 28 talks that I gave or in my activities as national coordinator from 72 to 73. I think we needed to make that clear.
They were a non-political organization.
Non-political.
And I agree, this was a cause everybody could get behind. If you were anti-war or you were in the military, everybody supported that. The problem was most people didn't know about it, so they had to get that word out there to make it known. And once it was known, people were horrified, and what can we do to help? So I agree with that. It was unique in that the anti-war people didn't oppose this or protest it.
That's right. That's important to know,
But so many people didn't even know that we were at war.
Right, no idea.
We gave talks in California at different organizations, and they were just appalled that there were POWs or MIAs. They had no idea. I don't know where their heads were.
I don't know.
Not watching the TV things, but
I still haven't figured that one out.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know why they wouldn't have, but they were shocked, and I was shocked that they were shocked.
They didn't know.
What do you mean you don't know? Yeah.
What did you feel? So you mentioned that you both made a lot of public appearances. So you went from being private military wives to putting yourself out there. I mean, how did that feel? Do you recall feeling scared, or do you have any incidents in mind that you remember from that time?
Sybil's the one that said, "Now we've got to get out there and tell these people." So she really kind of got us organized, at least in the local papers and local radio stations, TV stations, so that they did come and interview us, and then people would contact Sybil and say, well, we want somebody to come and talk to us. And so that's how all of us got involved, at least in San Diego, as far as going out. Sometimes we went to LA a few times to give speeches, and all you were doing was just telling your story.
And they probably would like to know about Colorado Springs, since Harlan Oaks is a citizen of Harlan. And when we were introduced, he also mentioned that Larry Oaks was our mayor of Colorado Springs. So my organization was called Colorado Springs for Prisoners of War and Missing in Action. And our mayor, Larry Oaks, who is a graduate of the University of Kansas and the brother of Harlan Oaks, gave us a free office in the basement of the police building so that we could get our organization started. And he was also the leader of a delegation that we sent to Paris with thousands of letters from Colorado Springs citizens asking for humane treatment and knowledge of all that were prisoners and missing. And so I think that's very important for you to know that. And Colorado Springs happens to be quite a military city. We have the Air Force Academy. We have Fort Carson, which is one of the biggest Army bases in the country. We have Schriever Air Force Base. And we have NORAD, which is North American and Canada's Defense Command. And so I had a lot of support once I started the organization, and that was in '69. And then I left for Washington from '72 to '73. And so that was my part in the war that I wanted to share with you today.
So in the exhibit, we talk a little bit about a gentleman named Bob Burrows. Would any of you like to talk about Uncle Bob? And we have many members of the Burrows family with us. We're honored that they traveled here for the exhibit opening. So tell us about.
That was our nickname for him. He was Bob Burrows. We called him Uncle Bob just because he was so much a champion of the wives. He, well, I can tell now that he would meet with us individually, and if we were writing letters, he would help us write coded letters that would go, hopefully reach the husband if they ever got through. Some did, some didn't. But that was his job, but he was a very big moral support for us. We felt like there was one person in the Navy at least, and the government that was on our side and didn't mind us talking and being upset with the Navy and our government for not giving us more information. You could imagine if one of your family members was missing, wouldn't you want to be informed, even if they don't know a whole lot, at least to talk to you.
Right,
Anyway.
and these women were really being
We were
watched.
upset after a while.
Yeah, their
Yeah.
government was under
Yeah.
LBJ, was not letting them know. They knew what was going on. They knew the torture was going
they
on.
did.
And they just were giving them the runaround for quite a while, really until the Nixon administration, for various reasons, decided that this was something they really needed to support. So Bob Burrows was really the only one who, and he was willing to go over and above, and also to do things to maybe skirt around it. I like him, he's a maverick. He's sort of like James Bond. He's gonna do whatever he's gotta do to help these women.
He was great.
So
He
Jenny
really
knew
was.
him. Helene did
Yeah.
not work with him because she was an MIA wife. So he's coding. Jenny's husband was a POW.
Well, also, he would favor the Navy wives.
Oh, yes. Well, that too.
Probably did, but.
That's a fair point.
As a naval
As a
commander.
naval
Yeah.
commander, yes, you probably would not have, there would have been an Air Force equivalent. Good point.
But that was during, he was an ally of the women during the time when you weren't comfortable, before you had decided to speak out or you weren't able to do
And
so.
he was encouraging in that respect. He said, don't tell anybody, but he was definitely an encouraging factor for us.
So Heath, you mentioned LBJ. What happens when the change of administration, when Nixon becomes president?
Yes, so LBJ, as you know, or many of you probably know, Vietnam did him in. He decided not to run for the presidency again. That was one of the major reasons. So in 1968, Nixon runs for president, Nixon wins. And the women have totally had it at this point, and they've also gone public on their own. Sybil is the first one to go public in the San Diego Union Tribune in October of 1968. And after that, it's like the floodgates open, and they start really ramping the talks up, the letter campaigns, TV, radio, etc. And the Nixon administration sees this, and Sybil lets him know, I love this about her, taking a page from the civil rights movement and some of the feminist movements, not really meaning to, she creates something called a telegraph in, or a telegram in, where she floods the Nixon administration office with telegrams to Nixon the day he's inaugurated saying, you better make the POW MIA issue top priority right now. And he takes notice. That helps a lot. It puts the visibility there. But of course, she's been working, all these women have been working to bring this to the attention of everyone in DC. And he knows also these are his voters. This is a big voting bloc. So it is done, also he's a veteran. I think he had a lot more empathy than LBJ did. LBJ was not really a veteran. That's kind of another issue, but Nixon was a true war veteran. I think he was very sympathetic. But remember, this was also a great voting bloc that he needed. He needed these women were part of the silent majority. So he wanted to cultivate them. The interests aligned between the Nixon administration and the women, and his administration was able to amplify what they were saying, give them a bigger voice. So it was a happy alignment of forces that really, it made a huge difference. Sybil's quote that's in the exhibit, I think, is about dark days in the LBJ administration, bright sunny days in the Nixon administration. I think that sums it up nicely with the difference.
And Helene, we've got a picture in the exhibit of you standing with Richard Nixon. Could you tell us a little bit about your visits to the White House or meetings with the president?
The picture is with Phyllis Galante, and I and Nixon and our vice chairman of the board, and he took us three women in front of Congress and bravely said how we were really the bravest women that he ever met. So it was a nice gesture on his part to do that.
And so by the time Nixon is president, many years have elapsed, we should emphasize. I mean, Heath, when are the POWs starting to get captured?
So they start really 64 is the first one down. And so 64, we're talking, almost 5 or 6 years before Nixon is really able to affect any change with that. So these women have spent a long time under a very oppressive environment with that. So Nixon comes in January of 69. So that's when things start to get better. The women's message has gotten out. Ho Chi Minh also dies, and the torture begins to stop. So it all kind of coalesces right around when Nixon takes office.
I mean, we're talking about years of not knowing. I mean, do you remember, any incident, any moments that you might have had or days that you might have had that were particularly, what is that like, not knowing for 3, 5, 11
for 7 years, huh? Wouldn't you say?
Those
Not
many
good,
years,
yeah.
yes,
Many
absolutely.
years,
Many lonely days, frustrating days, anger. Yeah.
It wasn't easy.
Perhaps it's really important to stress what we were doing.
Yes.
We were trying to get humane treatment for the prisoners and the missing, and the North Vietnamese were not obeying the Geneva Conventions.
Which they had
And but we had not declared war, was their statement, and that's why they were keeping the prisoners and missing secret. So as he said, when Nixon took over, then we were really helping the government in the war.
Absolutely.
Our cause was helping them.
That's right.
And I think it was very influential in bringing the end to the war and the prisoners' return.
So talk a little bit about your first presence in Washington, about what time, about what year, and what form did that take?
Well, I was in Washington from 72 to 73. And as you probably know, the prisoners came back in January of 73 during my term of office. And you can imagine the desolation of the missing in action families, because we didn't know what was going to happen to our men. Were they still alive? Were they keeping it a secret? Would we ever see them again? Would they just declare them all dead within a year? And we decided that wasn't going to happen. And so that's why it took so long then for the government to even get permission to go into Vietnam and to examine the crash sites and so forth. My year in Washington was a difficult one, but I was very glad that I could do what I could do. My husband would want me to do that. And so it took many years before we would know that a crash site was found and so forth. And of course, some of them had gone in over water and some had gone into a mountain. And so there were a lot of work to be done. And the National League of Families decided to continue until a true accounting, and it is still working today. And last year, my daughter and I, who's in the audience, went to the National Convention and met with our Air Force representatives to discuss our cause. Some of the things you did in Washington was you continually visited the congressmen and to remind them, some of whom needed reminding. And there were times when it was very difficult because probably the best thing that happened was because of Nixon mainly, that we were given permission. If you can imagine, we weren't ambassadors of any kind, but we traveled to Europe in an airplane and went and visited all these different heads of state in different countries, asking them to support us and to pressure North Vietnam to adhere to the Geneva Conventions and give us information about our men. So it was, every day there was some trauma of some kind, but we persevered.
Mm-hmm. Where did you travel? What countries did you travel to, and who did you travel with?
I actually was with Mr. Habib in Geneva, and I will tell you, I have limited French, okay? But I think he pretended that he couldn't speak English. And so he made me struggle with my French to come up with these words like, so. That was, I will never forget it. Never forget it.
And you traveled with Phyllis Galante, right, on occasion?
Yes, but with actually there were 174 in an airplane that went to all different countries. But I was assigned to him because of the French language. And this woman, she would have done a better job because...
I could help you.
Right.
Well, one of the women that's featured in the exhibit is Louise Mulligan, and there's that wonderful event on May 1st, 1970. Were either of you there, or do you remember anything about it? Or Heath, could you tell us a little bit about it?
Sure, I don't think either of you ladies were there.
Where?
That was kind of before, May 1st, 1970, Constitution Hall.
No, I was not there, no.
Helene came later.
Yes.
So this was May 1st, 1970, and this was Senator Dole and Sybil Stockdale got together and started talking early in 1970 because there had been a rally at Constitution Hall in January where only a couple of hundred people had shown up, and everyone was just disgusted. This is ridiculous. For this kind of cause, we should have a lot more. So actually, Senator Dole called Sybil and said, help. I think it was, it was mutual. They both knew they could help each other. So they joined forces and allied to bring 3,000 people to Constitution Hall. He said, we're going to do this again. We're going to do it right. So they had another rally for the POW MIA clause, and that also was part of the first National League convention because the League would be incorporated that summer. I believe it was in June of 1970. The League was incorporated, got an office, etc. But that night, it's called the May Day event. It was actually the International Appeal for Justice was Senator Dole's evening event. And at that event, Louise Mulligan, another POW wife who's in the exhibit, started her speech. She just shouted, "Mayday, Mayday," in this really loud voice, and the audience was kind of shocked. But then she went on to say, "This is a pilot's call for help. Please help us." And this just had an amazing effect. I kind of call her the Joan of Arc of the POW MIA movement. She really gets a visceral response from the audience. And this is when the tide really starts to turn. So that event is crucial to understanding this movement, and it's the turning point, so.
Now, so she's on let's get clear, so she's on the East Coast, she's a Virginia wife.
Yes, she is a Virginia Beach wife. There's a bunch of wives out of Virginia Beach. There's a naval air base called Oceana right there near Norfolk. So Jane Denton is out of there also. Phyllis Galani lives in Richmond, but she goes there to meet with the wives in the early days. Louise Mulligan is there, Janie Schutte, many others. So that's a big focal point for the East Coast POW MIA movement.
Jenny.
In 1970, we went, my daughter and son, myself, a girlfriend, and her 3 kids went to Paris for the Paris Peace Talks, hoping. We went to the Vietnamese embassy, and of course we were not allowed in. But we went there to hopefully gain information.
And those
So that
visits
was-
were also for awareness, right? Publicity and
yes.
awareness.
Oh, yes.
So did you
Yeah.
I know that you spoke to the press extensively when you were there. Did you do that also?
Yes, oh, yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that accomplished
had-
a lot, I think.
Yeah. I did.
Just the world knew these poor wives are knocking at the door of the embassy. They won't let you in. They leave letters. They won't take them. It was just, so the coverage that they got accomplished
It was pretty
a
good.
lot. That was well worth going, even though they never got to see the North
No.
Vietnamese at the embassy.
No, we didn't,
So,
yeah. But we did have the press that was following us and the kids holding pictures of their dad. That was tough.
So did you, along the way, I mean, did you feel, were there moments where you felt empowered? Did you feel tired? This is a years-long process, and can you talk about the experience with your children and just what that's like as a mother with your children?
I
How
have
do you?
one little incident that I think that brought it home to me. We were in Lemoore, and my kids were 2 and 3 when their dad left. And so it was about a year and a half later, and the oldest one now is in kindergarten. And all that, you don't know what they're making of all of the wives getting together and talking, and it was always, well, Dad's a prisoner. Well, when my daughter came home and had drawn a picture of Dad with bars, she thought he was in jail. I thought that was, that was a very big impact on me.
and a lot of the kids were teased. I know, I think it was some of the Stockdale children
Yes,
were telling me they were
yes.
teased in school, your dad's
yeah.
in prison.
Yes.
Well,
Well, that's all, yeah.
That was really hard, I think, for the older kids particularly that were getting along in school. So it was terrible.
Someone that we interviewed for the exhibit was Assistant Secretary of Defense Dick Capon. And could you describe a little bit about that office and how their interaction with the wives?
Sure. Well, and the wives can tell you, and I'm not sure in Colorado Springs, but on the West Coast, they well remember the Washington Road Show.
Yes, we do.
And they called it the Washington Road Show. It was sort of a joke because they were like, oh, great, here come the slicksters from Washington to tell us what we already know, and we know more than they do, which you did. So Dick Capon, who was the Assistant Secretary of Defense under Melvin Laird, came. I think they brought a Korean War vet, and they also brought Frank Sieverts, who was the Assistant Secretary of, I believe, Assistant Secretary of State at that time. So they had a State Department rep, a Defense Department rep, Korean War vet, and there was a very momentous meeting, you may remember hearing about at Miramar Station, where the POW MIA wives just had a complete fit. One of them, and rightly so, because they were lecturing to them about all this stuff, and they were like, we don't care, we just want to know what's going on. And one of the wives had painted a portrait of her husband and smashed it on the floor in front of everyone and said, go back to Washington and tell them that's what I think. So they had it.
Yeah.
And it was later called, it was a hornet's nest or whatever. But this was very good because they saw, Dick Capon saw, Frank Sievert saw, that they could not keep a lid on this. People were revolting. They had it. So they better do something. And I do think some of them also just, as they should, morally felt it was their obligation to help these women, to make this an issue. I know Melvin Laird and Dick Capon, they really did want this to be something that was high on the radar of the Nixon government. So they proposed at a conference later on that they really help these ladies go public. Now, the ladies had already gone public, but again, it gave them some amplification to have a lot of amplification, to have the Nixon administration behind them, to have the contacts, to give them a venue. But it took people flipping out. Finally, it had reached a boiling point, and there were a lot of people who said, these women and families are going to mutiny if you don't do something. So
There was going to be a political fallout.
yes, right.
That was our leverage. I think
Yes.
that was about.
I think it was, and it worked.
Jenny, were you able to connect with your husband? Did you exchange letters with your husband while he was in prison?
I did not receive anything from him because when he was shot down and after the torture, he pretended he couldn't use his arms or hands. And so that was a way that he could be important in the camp of passing information because they figured he couldn't do anything. And so they didn't, watch him quite as closely. They kept him in isolation, but he was able to tap and carry on conversations and pass information, and they didn't suspect him. Yeah. So I did not receive any letters from him. I do know that he received a couple from me. I do know that.
Some of the ladies came to rely on, during that keep quiet period or even beyond, they came to rely on communication that was facilitated by who, Heath?
Bob Burrows again.
Well, Bob Burrows and actually from the left, the anti-war movement.
Oh, yes,
as you
of
say.
course. Yeah, Bob, of course, was facilitating the coding process. But yes, the left, and this is a surprising part of the story that has gotten a little bit bigger the more that I've dug. But anti-war activists, so you have military wives in the military on, more conservative side, and more to the left, you have the anti-war movement. And they are very separate. They do not want to talk to each other. Totally separate poles. However, some of the wives, as the war went on, were getting increasingly frustrated. And they wanted to, A, be more political, and B, they wanted to work with the anti-war folks. And there were groups, Women Strike for Peace, and later the Committee of Liaison under Cora Weiss, who some of you might remember. And Cora was the biggest one. She and David Dillinger, her co-chair, had this organization where they would take letters for the POW families to Vietnam and bring back names and bring back letters. But this came they would insert propaganda, they would try to exert pressure on the wives, so it was sort of a double-edged sword. But many of the wives said, if we had to do a deal with the devil to get information about our husbands, we would do it. And I think that's very legitimate. I mean, some people chose to use that route, some didn't. But it got to the point where only the anti-war activists could get letters through. They had shut the Nixon government down, and the Red Cross was just worthless. They couldn't get through because the North Vietnamese wouldn't let them in. So the only route to get information at a certain point was through the anti-war activists. And Tom Hayden, for instance, took letters for Jane Denton over to Vietnam and did bring some information back. So they became very useful and the only outlet. And the last people on earth any of you wanted to work with, but you kind of had to sometimes. So
His wife didn't do us any justice at all.
Jane Fonda.
No.
Yes, Jane didn't, no, Jane didn't, she was very on the periphery, and she really didn't interact with the wives hardly. She made her statements, but she didn't interact with
No,
many
but
of
she
you.
went over there.
Oh, yes, she went over
and
there.
had the names in her hand
And she would,
and turned
she
them
gave
in
it to the North
to
Vietnamese.
the North Vietnamese Guard.
Right. Yeah.
She did.
Yes, and that's why most POWs are not fond of her.
Hanoi Jane?
Yes.
That's
Right.
putting it mildly.
Yes.
Not fond of her.
It is.
They hate her.
Understatement.
I'm not fond of her.
Yes,
Doesn't
it is
work.
for sure.
Yeah, she's not their
She's
favorite.
Hanoi Jane to all of us.
Hanoi Jane.
Yeah.
But I will say on that account, yes, Cora Weiss, though, was probably a lot more insidious because she had a bigger reach and she was much smarter about it. So she, yes, that's a whole other issue. It could be a whole other debate. But war makes for strange bedfellows, I think.
How many hundreds of men were kept as prisoners of war?
The total tally, what was it like?
Well, actually, about just over 600 came
600
home.
came, right.
But then we have a list of at
there
least
were more.
50 or more that died in captivity
Right.
because they were tortured so. When the National League first began, we were working for 1,300 men. That was our motto, 1,300 men. And so of the 650 who came home and the 50 who died in prison, we still had the remainder who were the missing in action. And those are the statistics I can remember.
And when did they start to come, so we have prisoners of war starting in 1964, and they finally come home how many years later, those that do come home?
73, right? It's-
Everett Alvarez was the very first.
Yes,
Okay.
he was
And
the
he was
first.
almost a year.
Yes, right.
Was it
As
64
the
or
single,
65?
64
Yeah,
he was.
64 for him.
And then Jim, and
And
then
then
we're
Jim
65.
Stockdale was 65.
65.
Uh-huh.
But
Right.
almost a
Yeah.
year of isolation,
Yeah.
being the only POW.
Right,
Just-
and he was not badly treated at first, but then the others got there and the torture really got going. So 64, and it's not till 73 that the prisoners are finally released.
And there's a big event in 73 for the men who come home.
Yes, the Nixon administration had the biggest party the White House has ever had, even to date, it was in May of 1974, or no, wait, 74,
73.
Thank you.
73.
1973, and they have tents, on the White House lawn. They have Bob Hope, Sammy Davis, all these, movie stars and entertainers, and they have this huge gala, and we do have some of the gala artifacts in there and a wonderful tape that the Nixon Library loaned to us of the gala. But only the POWs were invited. These ladies can tell you they were not invited to the event. So it was for the POWs.
It was for the
As
POWs.
Jenny
Yeah.
pointed out earlier
Yeah.
to me.
It was.
But the POW wives were invited, but not the MIA wives, including
Or
Helene, who was
KIA.
running the National
Right.
League. And they both had dates to it. They both were asked, both these ladies
Yes.
were asked to
By
go as the
POW,
dates
yeah,
of
by
POWs.
POWs.
But why did they say no to that?
They never gave us really a reason. It was just mainly because it was for the return POWs.
And unseemly, I guess, for some strange and crazy reasons. So, again, the government was just not always very sensitive to the women and their concerns.
So I have one more question before we open it up to the floor. So the men, the POW, the returned prisoners of war come home in 73, and then what do each of you do? Jenny, you mentioned your husband. How did you find out about the fate of your husband?
When they said the men were going to be released, then they told me.
And did you continue as part of the National League afterwards?
No, not really. No,
And Helene, you
it was a
continued.
grieving.
How did that affect, your, post 73, what kind of activities did you engage in, if any?
What was 73, what?
After the prisoners of war were returned in 73, after that date, how does that did that affect you at all? Were
Well,
you,
of course,
what kind of
because-
work are you doing at that
Yes,
point?
it affected me greatly because none of the prisoners, most of the prisoners that I talked to did not hear his name through the system, and they had a wonderful system, as she mentioned, of tapping and letting when a new man came into the prison. So I knew then that I might never see him again, but I still had the hope that they would find his crash site and be certain of that. And so I waited and I prayed. I prayed a lot because my faith is very important to me. That helped. So,
And and she continued to work, you finished her term as the coordinator
Yes,
of the National.
I finished my term.
Which was all going on
Yeah,
during that
yeah.
time.
And I think, because I love my town so much, I'd like to remind our audience, because I didn't, when I talked about Colorado Springs, how important the Air Force Academy cadets were to us, because I formed a Big Brother association with them. And so they were able to, come into our homes and be a male figure for our children. And so our cadets really supported us during that period of time, and they continue to. But soon after that, we closed down that organization. But I did want to bring that up. Okay.
But there
So-
still is an organization that is for the MIAs, isn't there
No.
still in DC?
No.
Oh, the
Yeah,
National
yeah,
League. you
yeah.
mean. Yes,
Oh,
yes.
the National League.
Yes,
Oh,
yes,
yes. Oh,
I
yes.
mean, so they're still
Yes.
active.
Yes,
Yeah,
they're still
yeah,
active.
yeah.
Yes.
It's a very different organization
It is
than
now,
when
yes.
Helene was there and
Right.
when you started it. It's very, of
Yeah.
course,
It is.
not POW,
Right.
all MIA.
It's all MIAs.
So,
And another thing, that was important too, was that the American Legion in Washington DC gave us our office space. And it was right on K Street. And believe it or not, we had a red phone in the office, and I could pick it up and call Kissinger whenever I wanted to. I never did.
That was my next question. Did you?
I wanted to find that red phone.
Yeah.
It's just gone,
Yeah.
so.
Yeah.
Let's
Yeah.
see what the questions are.
Sure, yeah,
Yeah.
thank you. Does anybody in our audience have a question? Thomas will come to you with a microphone.
I know you
Don't
have
be
questions.
shy.
Yes, I know you have questions. Be brave. No.
Did you ever know Betty Foley, wife of Brendan Foley?
You hear
Who,
that?
Oh, I didn't, never, I haven't
he
heard of
went missing in, I
What was
think
the
it was
question?
Foley?
Brendan
Anyone know
Foley,
someone
Betty
named-
Foley.
Absolutely, yes.
Oh,
They were,
He was Dermot Foley, the lawyer? Dermot Foley, the lawyer?
Brendan Foley.
Brendan Foley.
Brendan Foley.
I know.
He was I think when he went to Vietnam, he was a captain, and he and his wife, Betty Foley, were good friends of my parents. We were Air Force family. And he went down in '67, and they think it was over Laos.
Oh, really?
And we didn't know he was missing in action until, I think, '71, when we moved to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And Betty was there. And it was really, I admire both of you ladies tremendously. She had, right before he left, she had his 5th child. And she actually had her 4th child in France with my mom in the military hospital. That's how we met, or how the families met. Anyway, we found out at that point that he was missing in action and had been since '67. And the 5th child had apparently been born with muscular dystrophy. But he had just gone over to Vietnam, and she never wrote and told him or anything because she didn't want him to have to worry about that, yeah. And so I know there was an article, I think in '74 in People magazine, I just read it not too long ago again, about she was a part of the League. And she had fought for years to not have him declared dead because she believed that if he was declared dead, no one would look for him any longer. So I thought that was really interesting. Yeah, but kudos to you ladies for everything you did for your husbands and supporting them in their return and still in the quest to find out what happened to them.
No, I didn't. Does Foley sound familiar to
I
you?
knew Dermot Foley, he was the lawyer. that worked
Anyone
so
else, any
hard
other
for
questions?
League. But I don't know about Brendan.
No, I don't know.
Thank you. Well, I tell you, you're some brave women. And just think, it wasn't just for you, but it was also for all of the other people out there as an education process. Did you ever receive anything official? I mean, that, you have a letter or a certificate or anything acknowledging the bravery of the missing in action, your husband, anything? And what kind of benefits did you receive?
So did you receive any official, anything
Official
thanking
for-
you for?
Any kind of notification?
from
Do you,
who-
yes,
from
Anything from the
thank you for
government?
this, did you receive a medal if he would have gotten one?
Oh, yeah,
Did
we-
you get any of that information, do you have anything that you can have in your hand, on your wall, that your children can see, your family can see? And then, what
A
about the
big-
benefits?
A big case I have of his medals. Yeah.
And what kind of benefits were you
You know,
acknowledged with?
when, before the men left, probably the same for you guys, before the men left, they would fill out a card. Do you want your wife to get, the family to get 80%, 100% of your pay if something should happen to you? And that was just a standard thing. And my husband put 100%. So that meant I was getting $300 a month at that time.
One thing about the
Which is
benefits,
not-
I'm gonna have a whole chapter about the financial hardships, and I know you're a former military wife, so one big problem when these men went to Vietnam, there was a 10% savings plan for those in the service. And guess who they forgot to include in this? Anybody POW or MIA. And so the POW wives were like, what about this? And Sybil was one that went to DC and fought for that. They said no, the wives appealed and they said, no, we're not gonna include them in that, that's just not right. Okay, so the wives said, no,
wait a
that's not
minute.
gonna happen,
Yeah.
and they fought hard, and they got the 10% savings plan for these families, but how horrifying that they were left out. And I have some letters where Sybil says, this just makes me sick to my stomach, that they left them out. The other problem was cashing checks, which right when they were shut down, they'd say, we need a forwarding address. Well, they're in the Hanoi Hilton, so that's gonna be really hard. I mean,
Or you couldn't
remember
buy,
this.
you couldn't, you know, if you wanted to buy a house, you wanted to open up a checking account, or you wanted to buy a house.
Buy a
I was
house.
interested in buying a house. They said, no, you have to get your husband's signature. I said, if you can get it, I'd be real happy to not buy that house even. But no, they wouldn't give you any credit. They wouldn't do anything for that. No, you couldn't get your own credit. You couldn't get you couldn't buy a house, no. You have to have your husband's signature. I
And
said,
if
I
you
would
didn't have-
love to get it.
Well, right, and if you didn't have power of attorney, some of the wives had it, and
Yeah.
it was a lot easier. If you didn't have it,
No.
you were in big trouble. Then people gave, I've got instance after instance, the hard time these women had, not to mention in the 60s, a single woman.
Yes, a
They didn't
single-
want to
that
rent
was
to you,
main-
they didn't want to
no.
sell you a house. I mean,
No.
there was
There
that
you are, a
whole
woman
thing.
with 2 kids, and you don't have a husband?
Yes.
No.
Oh, we're not gonna rent to you. So it was ridiculous. Now, not all wives had this problem. I know Helene had said the Air Force was really good about that. I've heard this
Yes.
complaint more actually from
From the
Navy
Navy.
wives, which is interesting. So, thank God for Bob Burris.
Yes.
He went to bat on this too.
Yeah, I did.
So there's a lot, that is an excellent question about benefits, because the finances for these women were so difficult for the first couple of years. And finally, they got straight. But the government was in no rush to correct this.
And that's something that I remember seeing in our collections, whether it was initiated by Senator Dole or just a piece of legislation that he had signed on to, but extending the power of attorneys that had expired because they needed to, so you had one for a year and a half. Well, your husband's missing for 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. You're gonna need something to take care of business, as you say. So it's incredible that legal limbo, just those
you wouldn't think about until you're
right.
faced with that.
And any legal cost arising from financial issues, the POW MIA families had to bear that cost. There was no fund to help them with that if they had to fight for power of attorney or financial rights. So, and the CACO, the casualty officers, could either be a big help with that or a big hindrance. And I've seen cases of both, so.
Yeah, great question. Any other questions out there? Yeah.
I just want to say thank you for coming. I'm from San Diego myself, and both
Oh,
my
are you?
parents were in the Navy, and they were stationed at Balboa Hospital.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'm curious if there was any benefit of living in San Diego or Fort Collins during this time. They're both military towns and cities. Was besides the the spouses helping each other out, was there anything that the military did for you in those cities? A network of counseling or anything like that?
Counseling? That's a nice thought. I wish I'd have known you. I wish you'd have said that. No, we did not have counseling. We were lucky to get information eventually. So no, there was no.
Now
no
there's
real
all
help.
kinds of stuff like that.
Yeah,
But no,
yes.
it just wasn't there. I don't know if the Air Force, if it was better. Colorado Springs, I will say, has the reputation as probably the best place to be. Again, Air Force versus Navy, but the wives did a lot better, fared a lot better there than San Diego, Lemoore, of course, awful. There's
Awful,
just
yeah.
really no
Nothing.
support there. And I don't even know why. I've tried to figure out why that's the case, but it just varies widely from town to town, so. No, none of that.
Anyone else? Yes.
I'll bet I could hear his voice better than that microphone.
Hello, I'm Tom Burrows. My father was Bob, that you mentioned a few times, and I do remember at times, especially later, after he had met with some of the wives, that some of the letters you got from your husbands came to our house. Was he trying to keep you from going to the higher ups? Because a lot of the information came directly to our home.
I think that was mainly to keep it from, maybe from, I don't know this, for sure, but yeah, I think it was just to keep it within the family, so to speak.
Because some of the original, we received some of the original letters
Uh-huh.
from the prisoners
Right, at the house, yeah.
Didn't go into the naval office.
Yeah, I think that was to keep it, because once it got there, you may not
Yeah.
see it. You may not see everything that was in it.
Yes. I think he knew better.
Yes, he
He knew
did.
it would be better
He
off.
knew,
with
he
him
was on our
floating
side.
around.
He really was on our side. And I think that's probably why those letters came.
And because
Came
the
to your house.
ladies really trusted him.
Yeah, we
but
did.
They didn't
We
trust the
did.
government, which,
Or the other Navy, roadshow people, but
Yes.
we did,
right.
Uncle Bob was wonderful to us.
See another question here.
How long did you receive benefits after your husband was either determined deceased or missing in action?
You received the benefits until you remarried. So you still get the
Well, I get,
medical and,
oh, yes, yes, yes.
Anyone else? Nope.
and the other.
I was wondering, we talked a little bit about the 60s and the cultural differences, expectations for women, and how you eventually decided to speak out. And I'm wondering how you feel that coincided with the feminist movement, with women's lib movement, or if you feel they were completely separate movements. Did you feel aligned with that cause, or did you feel that it was a totally different situation?
Different situation. This is the granddaughter of Sybil Stockdale,
Yes.
who just asked the question.
Yeah.
He's our
Assistant curator.
Yeah, I don't think it coincided at all. And that's probably not was our focus. Our focus was our husband and getting information there. I think it really kind of started in the 60s, but we weren't focusing on that. We weren't trying to put ourselves out there as much as we were trying to get information. Let's do something for our husbands, find out about them. We didn't think about throwing our bras out into the fire at that time. We just didn't. That came in the 60s. We were not instrumental.
Well, and a lot of people who are more conservative too in the military and the FBI, by the way, the anti-war movement, feminism, and civil rights were all kind of lumped together as suspect. So I went in, had my training being, 47, it's like, everyone's a feminist, this is great. That's not the case at all. It is, some people were reading Betty Friedan and reading Ms. Magazine. I think towards the end, Karen Butler,
Yeah.
they told me she had the subscription she hid, So people were starting to think about this, but I don't think that was the impetus. It was the
not
husbands
at
and
the time.
the humanism. It was like a human rights activism, I would say. And I, for a long time, thought the causes must be allied, but they really were very separate.
They were.
So,
Not that we don't agree. but
yes.
At
Now,
that time,
yes,
we
and
were
your
not.
grandmother said she was a feminist
Yes.
later. Not right then, but
Not
later
right then,
on,
but
she
yeah.
did, so.
Got another one.
I have a couple of different questions. One is about when and how did Uncle Bob get involved in all of this? And I don't know if they're two kind of unrelated questions, so I don't know if we can do one and then the next, or, okay.
Well,
That one first.
that one is a great question. Your family has been wonderful. I was lucky enough to reach out over Facebook, thank you, Facebook, to Lynn over here, who's one of Bob Burrow's daughters, Lynn Amwake, and we talked, and they have been wonderful about agreeing to let me work with them to get Bob's military records, because he is a very shadowy figure, and I think he started his espionage activities way before Vietnam, and he was called back because he was really good at what he did. So we soon will have the military records, and you will find out more, and your family will get those first, and then hopefully share them with me so we can figure out the time frame. But from my research, from what I know, I think it may have started as early as the Cuban Missile Crisis. There's some indication he might have been involved in doing something there, and then was probably cultivated, was recruited to continue with that. So we don't know for sure, but I hope that we will, and believe me, I'm dying to know, probably as much as you are. And I think the ladies will be very interested to know that, and that will all be in the book, so you'll have to wait a little bit. And your other question?
Yeah, so then my other question was just about, I'm curious about the communications in general, like what, other than asking, where is my husband and what's happened to him, what kind of information was going back and forth both into and out of Vietnam, and then also, Jenny, with your husband, like what kind of
What was going on?
communication?
Information
going back and
flow,
I think
yeah.
she means the
And
coding
then-
information.
Yeah, and then Jenny, you'd mentioned about, around, the secret communications that were enabled by your husband. What else were they kind of telling each other besides, who came in? And I'm just curious what kind of stuff was being passed.
That I can't really speak for any of the POWs. I just know from talking to them when they came back that that was their support, was just talking to each other, the tapping, and they asked prayers and information about families, anything, any kind of support they could be for each other, not just who was just in here, who just was shot down and, And of course, the newest person that was shot down could bring in information of what's going on at home.
Yes.
For others who had been there 2 or 3 years or something that didn't.
There were several instances I remember kind of laughing about. The new guy would come in and say, I saw your wife at the officers club 2 weeks ago, and blah, 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 and they would tap all this out. So the new people would bring in more information, and then more national topical things like Ho Chi Minh is dead, yay, things like that. But the coding, the TAP code, what it really did is kept the morale up, and it kept the military structure. That is how the chain of command was established, was through the TAP code system. So it had Jim Stockdale was really instrumental in that, Jerry Denton, in establishing this and keeping everybody's spirits up. And that, by the way, is one of the reasons why the rate of PTSD among these POWs is incredibly low. because they had that community of support, and the wives mirrored this. They didn't know they were doing it, but they had the same community of support at home through the league in San Diego and then the National League. So they didn't even know, but they were doing kind of the same thing, so.
Any other questions out there? I have one more, if there aren't any from the audience. One ally that we didn't discuss at all was Ross Perot, and he appears in our exhibit. Could you talk a little bit about any interaction with him or research that you've done, Heath, about Ross Perot?
I think you met him on a number of occasions.
Yes, and
you did too.
in the exhibit, there is a book that was written by a journalist in Colorado Springs, and you'll see it. It's called Daddy Won't Be Home for a Long Time. And that book is full of letters that children wrote, including some of our children, to Hanoi to try and help our prisoners. That at that time, right in the front of the book, is a picture of Ross Perot meeting with us at the Air Force Academy. And he was very helpful. And I'm sure a lot of our people in the audience know all that he did when he took plane loads of things and tried to deliver them to the prison. And
Christmas packages.
And he was doing this
Yeah.
as a private citizen, right?
Yes,
He's just
funding himself,
Yeah.
spending thousands of dollars, just trying to raise awareness, placing ads in the newspaper, helping with letter writing campaigns, sponsoring conferences to educate people. He also, a number of the MIA families have said that he helped with scholarships for their children to go to the Naval Academy or Virginia Military Institute's another one. He did so much. And just, I mean, more than you can imagine, more than any other private citizen did. So, yes. And he also ended up running for president, as some of you may remember, with Jim Stockdale as his running mate.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
and that was because Sybil, said, Jim, you gotta do it. He really had tried to help you before.
there were quite a few organizations that helped our children, for which we're very grateful. And one was the Red River Valley Fighter Pilots Association. And they actually gave a lot of scholarships to our children. And I'll tell you, my daughter got a scholarship from Coors Beer.
That's good.
The Tailhook organization is another one that has been very supportive.
well, thank you all so much for the conversation. Thank you, Jenny.
Thank you to the
for
audience.
having us.
Thank you for coming.
Before we adjourn, I did want to specifically mention the folks in our audience. So Minda, who asked the question, but Minda Stockdale, would you stand and be recognized? She's our assistant curator on the exhibit, and it's been wonderful to work with her. I think Christine Bartley, our filmmaker, had to leave a little bit early, but we think her films are in the exhibit, and just a wonderful talent at doing oral history and taping with you all. So we could recognize her.
Thank you.
Kylie Hewitt and Sarah D'Antonio and Julie Burgundy, staff and students in the archive, helped produce the exhibit in these last weeks and really over the course of the development. So thank you guys. And all of you Burroughs family members, would you raise your hand or stand up? Thank you so much. And finally, if there are any Vietnam veterans, former POWs, or family members of Vietnam veterans, please raise your hand or stand and be recognized so we can thank you for your service. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Enjoy the rest of your day. We hope to see you. Bring your friends and family to the exhibit. Spread the word. Thanks so much.